Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are discussing Richard III and we're on to Act 1, Scene 3 and Scene 4 today. So as always, I'll give a brief discussion of what happened in these scenes and then get a little deeper into some of the issues. So, Scene 3, you want a fight? Let's have some fights. Scene 3 starts with the Queen, so King Edward's wife, complaining about his health. Well, she's not really complaining. She's just deeply worried about it. And complaining about the fact that Richard is probably going to be the protector of the realm after Edward dies, because their sons are in their minority. They're little kids. So, I think we already know where this is going to go. And a few more gentlemen come into the scene to tell the Queen, don't worry, Edward's feeling much better. He's cheerful, he's talking. He wants you and your family to be reconciled with his brother Richard. And it gets even more complicated when Richard himself enters the scene, loudly complaining about the fact that people have been lying to Edward about him, saying he's a bad guy. Who would even say that to his brother? He's not the bad guy. Why you do this? Cue an entire, just multiple person squabble between Richard, the Queen, and her gentleman about who's to blame for Edward's opinion on practically everybody, because everybody's willing to point fingers here. It's even better when the previous Queen, King Henry's wife, Margaret, enters the scene to periodically comment about how childish this is all going, and really, she deserves to have all the power, and they kicked her out of it. She doesn't stay away very long, though. Finally, she says, I gotta get involved in this myself, and goes for it just 110% with the curses, and the insults, and the vague warnings about Richard being a dog who's gonna make everybody regret everything. And it turns out, this wasn't a good plan. Before Margaret got involved, they were all willing to help kill each other. Turns out, once Margaret's involved, all of them team up to take her down. Didn't see that coming. She seems surprised about it. But again, she offers a few more vague warnings about Richard being the bad guy. And then heads off. And somehow this seems to have reconciled everybody that was arguing earlier, because they leave in relatively good terms. Well, Richard stays on stage because he's got a meeting with some executioners. Turns out he's gonna kill Clarence because Edward's sick and Clarence needs to be out of the way before Edward dies. You're a bad brother, Richard. No way around that. Scene 4, meanwhile, Clarence is in prison. Turns out he's had a bad dream, and he's telling his jailer about it. Apparently, Richard's at fault. Accidentally, of course. And Clarence dreams that he dies, and is haunted by the previous Edward, Prince of Wales ghost, for his part in all of that horrible murder business. And he thinks to himself, well, when it comes to Judgment Day, he's probably doomed. But he wants to get some sleep, so he asks the jailer to hang out. This works relatively well until the executioners show up. Jailer takes the note from him and says, I don't even want to know what's happening. I'll just leave. And leaves. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you there. Dude, Clarence trusted you and you literally cut and run. What I find very interesting about the scene, though, is the morality argument is presented by two executioners. In fact, the second executioner has to take a pause because he's starting to feel a little guilty about this murder business, until the first executioner reminds him about the reward he's supposed to be getting, and then a lot of that conscience thing disappears. Mind you, against Richard's orders and suggestions, they actually allow Clarence to not only wake up, but to start talking with them, and Clarence starts to reason relatively well that all of this is probably not a good plan. But they let him believe that Edward is the one trying to kill him rather than Richard, And so Clarence actually tells them, you know what, go find my brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He'll pay more for my life than Edward will pay for my death. And that's when the executioners drop some hints, and when he doesn't get it, outright tell him, Richard is in fact the one trying to murder your ass. Poor Clarence then gets stabbed probably several times, once on stage, and then the first executioner drags him off to finish the job, because this is Shakespearean theater, and we have to be very careful about what bloody business we do on stage. And then it turns out that second executioner, who was feeling a little bit of a guilty conscience, does not participate in this murder because that guilty conscience came back. And he now regrets the fact that the Duke, Clarence, is dead. Little too late for that dude. Little too late. And that's actually where Act 1 ends. So, isn't that great? We are literally only one act into this play, and we've already murdered somebody who really probably didn't deserve to get stabbed as many times as he did. Excellent. So, with that said, let's talk a little bit about what this is telling us about our players. Because we've met a few more people now, including the current queen, who both Clarence and Richard were sort of talking about being against them in regards to whispering in Edward's ears. We've met the previous queen, Queen Margaret now. She's a treat. We've met some executioners, and we've officially packed off one of our players. But keep in mind, all of these people in some way have an effect on the play. So while Clarence might have kicked it by the end of Act 1, that action is still going to be applicable through the rest of the play. Like, Richard's not going to be able to get away from the fact that he murdered his brother. And this is very interestingly sort of brought up several times in different ways. Most obviously, I think, is Clarence's dream about the murder of the previous Prince of Wales, also named Edward, because royal families are really confusing. Because he has this dream about Edward's spirits haunting him and sicking the Furies on him. And the Furies is an interesting image to look at because we have this idea that the Furies are vengeance creatures. But what you need to keep in mind is, truthfully, they're usually meant as family avengers. If you do something to a family member, then the Furies come after you. So, Edward and Clarence, the Prince of Wales Edward, spirit haunting him in this dream Edward, and Clarence, probably don't have a really close family line connection. It's probably there. Like I said, royal families are complicated. But Richard and Clarence certainly do have that familiar connection. Richard is more likely to be affected by Furies than Clarence necessarily is for this, because he is actively killing his own brother. But this type of haunting imagery is not just presented in the dream. The dream is the most apparent one, where we know somebody who is dead, their spirit is somehow showing up in a supernatural way, this dream type thing. But even back in scene 3, we're actually getting this haunting idea through Margaret especially. Because when she first comes in, she seems to be more of a ghost in this scene until she actively decides to participate in the conversation happening. From a good section of the scene, she's actually on the fringes of everything, and is making aside comments. So comments that the audience can hear, but as asides, nobody else on the stage is supposed to hear. Which, I mean, again, within a theater space, yes, the other actors are going to hear these comments. They need to be able to hear their cues. But we can recognize asides are meant to only be heard by the audience, not by the other players on the stage. So Margaret comes in and she's making these comments about how cursed these people are and all the horrible things they did, and she's actually acting as this sort of haunting spirit through this first section of scene 3. where she's chiming in and nobody else can hear her. And then she makes her presence known fully and involves herself in the conversation. But from there, she sort of moves, interestingly enough, from this ghost-like aspect into another strangely supernatural one of a prophetess. And she identifies herself as this in the end of the scene, when she says that Richard's going to make everybody regret siding with him, and everyone will call Margaret a prophetess. She's come in with the recognition of exactly what Richard is, because she can also recognize what everybody else is as well. You know, of course, she does come across as probably recognizably and appropriately bitter. She has effectively been dethroned, her husband and son have been killed, and she's actively a captive here among the people who now have the throne, who are all calling her a lunatic. So yeah, she might be a little pissed off by the current queen, but she is right in pointing out that none of them are really working together, and they're undercutting their own arguments by constantly infighting amongst themselves. So, like, Margaret sees things in a very clear way that nobody really wants to listen to her about, because she comes across as this raving lunatic, when truth be told, she's calling people out for their actions during the war, or inactions. She actually thanks Buckingham for not getting involved and not murdering her family. But we also see that no one's willing to side with Margaret. Even Buckingham sort of backs off, because he's just like, again, because Margaret's not in power. The ruling family has to be the side you agree with. And this has interesting echoes when you think, again, Shakespeare writing again for the side that won the War of the Roses, which is not these people. Like, Edward here and Richard here and Clarence here are actually the losing side at the end of the war. So we've got all of these layers going through about previous actions coming back to haunt you, and then having to address those actions in some way, or actively ignore them. And that's actually what Shakespeare's even doing here, where he's playing up the crimes of the losing side. And he's also, I mean, he mentions some of the crimes of the winning side, the previous crimes, because they actually mention, like, the killing of a child. And Margaret says, what, you literally killed my entire family because of one kid? And it's like, well, there's some balance there, right? That's an admission that crimes were done on both sides. This is true with most wars, but the side of the victor doesn't always want to admit it. But the interesting aspect here is admitting to that crime is done in this very weird way, where Margaret is sort of teamed up against by all of these disparate groups on the currently winning side. So the talk about the crime there is not the main focus, simply because she's the underdog in this scene. We know Richard's the bad guy, so truth be told, most of the audience is more likely to root for Margaret as this haunting presence and prophetess, rather than the current winners. So, like, Shakespeare can bring up this killing of a child because it's done in a way that undercuts the seriousness of that issue. Because Richard III is one of the main accusers here. And he's going to go on, spoiler alert, in the rest of the play, to probably kill some more children. And so, we get this weird sort of haunting ghost coming in scene 4 to really draw attention to how your past actions haunt you and haunt your history. And that's going to play forward, certainly, like I said, because Clarence dying here doesn't mean Clarence is fully out of the play and we can just ignore him now. That action is going to mean something in the future. But we also have to back read that framing device that Clarence gives us at the start of scene 4. We need to move that framing device back a little bit to actually take a look at what happened in the previous scene and how we have this ghost haunting these people just as Clarence is haunted in his dreams. So it's this really interesting haunting image back playing and then playing again forward through the entire play. And a lot of people have probably read more Shakespeare, particularly the Scottish play. I'm not in a theater, so I should be fine saying it. Macbeth really plays on this ghost imagery. So finding it in other plays is not surprising. But allowing it to exist in a history play, again, needs to we need to be able to move a little bit in our genre definition to be able to include and legitimately consider the supernatural aspects that are happening and how these supernatural aspects can happen in real life, right? Maybe spirits don't happen, but your conscience can certainly haunt you. And people from your past can certainly haunt you. Even quite physically, like Margaret does here. Which is very interesting to pair up then with a conversation of morality made by two executioners. I mean, it's a very direct pairing, especially since there's Clarence talking about this dream of his guilty conscience, and then the executioners come in, and one of them's literally like, give me a minute, I'm kind of feeling like we shouldn't do this, just give me a minute, it will go away, give me a second. No, I'm still feeling a little guilty, and having the other executioner say, like, well, then you're not gonna get paid, and he's like, zounds! That's literally a word used twice in scene 4 is zounds. I was just like, I just hear zoinks from Scooby-Doo. Like, oh, you're right! My consciousness, and conscience is tucked into the Duke of Gloucester's purse. It's fine, I can do this now, and then not being able to. It's this interesting idea of how easily can you put away a guilty conscience for a reward. And interestingly enough, right before I read this scene, Extra Credits currently is doing a run about politics, and politics as gaming. And the episode I just watched this morning was about cheating. And it's precisely this combination of exterior consequences and interior consequences, which mainly is guilt, versus, the reward you'll actually receive if you cheat. And it's precisely this type of conversation that's happening right now. Because Richard is effectively trying to cheat the system in, the most violent way he possibly can, which is to kill his brother Clarence. And the executioners then, in being involved, have to deal with this guilt as well, because they're directly involved here. And the second executioner does bring up a legitimate question that we need to keep in mind in society today, which is, even if I have permission to do this thing, does that then give me forgiveness for doing it? Because what the executioner says is, I recognize we have this, written thing telling us to go and murder this man, but can I hand this, when I die, can I hand this writ that says, by the order of the king, kill Clarence, can I hand this to God at the pearly gates and him just go, oh yeah, no, that made that murder fine, come on in. Because that's a different thing, right? You can say I was following orders, but that doesn't mean what orders you're given are right. And this is a morality question that is a very serious one, especially in wartime. This is one of those moral questions that comes up in the military a lot. Which is, if I'm told to do this thing, and I do it, am I then forgiven for doing that thing purely because I had orders to do it? This is precisely the banality of evil. I was just following orders. I did not make this choice to do this thing. I was just following orders. And Shakespeare just takes this one little scene. He doesn't even go into it super in depth, but he just digs into it, and it hurts. Because the second executioner does not do it. In asking this question, there is this moment where he looks like he is going to do it. And then he doesn't. Because he recognizes it was wrong. He doesn't even necessarily have to recognize that Richard is the bad guy and he's doing all these horrible plans so he can have power. He purely recognizes that Clarence did not deserve to die. And that's all Shakespeare has to do. If we are paying attention, that is all Shakespeare has to do to make us suddenly ask the question, is following orders or following the law, when the law is unlawful or cruel, the correct thing to do? And that is constantly going to be a hard question for us to ask ourselves, especially in today's society. Punching people is wrong, but is punching a Nazi wrong? This is something we're dealing with in society today. How far are we going to successfully get when society says the moment you step out of line in regards to the law or political correctness or societal norms, you're wrong. It doesn't matter what you're fighting for. The moment you step beyond those things, you're wrong, and we can't take you seriously. Because most people will tell you, when you dig into it, resistance against something like the Nazis or other terrible leaders and terrible governments has precisely been in breaking laws and breaking social norms. It's been hitting Nazis with purses. It's been blowing up bomb factories with fish oil bombs. That was a thing. It has precisely been going against the laws to do the right thing, even if somebody tells you not to do it that way. So interestingly enough, while we watch a bunch of people just squabble and curse each other and insult each other in scene 3, it is surprisingly the moral argument between these two executioners in scene 4 that becomes the heart of the discussion of this play. Richard III might be the titular character, but he is not the person we should be learning positive lessons from. One of the positive lessons might actually be executioner number 2. Well, maybe if we can avoid having our friends murder people, that might help a little more too. So, I've been talking quite a bit, so I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.